Hi there, girls. So today in class, when we were talking about our stitch book, I did tell you all that I was going to send you the handouts that I've used when I teach the class, and I did that. But I wanted to follow it up with making just a video talking about some of the things that are not explained very well in the handouts. And the reason why this information isn't in the handout is because when I teach this class as a live class, one of the things that I try to do with the students is to walk them through the process of just the different things that they need to think about as they plan out what kind of techniques and different things like that that they want to incorporate into their own stitch book. So what I want to tell you first off the bat is that I have made several stitch books in my history of sewing. Some of them were bigger than others depending on how many stitches that the sewing machine had, and so I have quite a bit of experience of not going to say that I'm a total expert at it or anything, but of actually processing the information about how I'm going to go about recommending to you that you think about creating your own stitch book. So the first thing that I'm going to show you is that these are just a couple of old samples of things that were possibilities that may have become pages in a stitch book, and they were failures for various reasons. You know, I've tried different kinds of things out over the years, and some things worked well and some things didn't. And what I've done with these pages is, because they are well stabilized fabric, I've just kept them in my sewing drawer, and I use them as little sample fabrics for times when I'm working on decorative stitches and I want to just practice stitching out something to see, you know, how it's going to work on my project. So I didn't throw them away, and if I actually looked at them closely, I would probably be able to see what it was that I learned and why they didn't actually make it into a stitch book. Okay, so at any rate, I just wanted to say that these are failures, and this right here, which is my Janome 12,000 stitch book, is not a failure because it's well thought out for what I wanted in my stitch book. So the first thing that I want to tell you is that in the handout, I give you some basic guidelines about what I thought about when I was making my book. Now, on our Janome 15,000 machine, if you were to open up your pages and start paging through, one of the things that you would notice in there is that on the average, you're never going to have more than 18 stitches per page in your sewing machine. So when I created my book, one of my primary goals was to try to match up a page in my book was going to be reflective of the page that's actually in the sewing machine for that particular stitch style. Okay, so when I designed my book, my pages were designed to have a title row in which I used one of the built-in fonts on my machine and wrote in the name of the type of that category of stitches. It has a information bar that goes along the side of each one of the pages, and that information bar is where I'm going to write in basically what the stitch number is for that particular stitch, and in some cases I might even write in a little bit more information in there. All right, so but basically each one of these pages is going to be reflective of 18 stitches, which are the page amount of stitches per page in the machine. All right, so the other thing that I don't talk a whole lot about in the handout is how you're going to figure out how much fabric and Decor Bond stabilizer you're going to need for your project. So the fabric that I used, and I did talk about this also today, was I purchased a large amount of very high quality premium muslin that was available at Hobby Lobby, and it still may be available there. It's not your typical muslin. It's not that lightweight kind of flimsy muslin that you might make some lightweight summer curtains out of or that kind of thing. It's a substantial weight, tightly woven fabric. So that's what I'm going to recommend for you also. You know, if you want to go and find a nice weight quilter's cotton that's either in a solid color or a reeds as solid, it needs to be something that is going to be very plain so that your stitches actually show up well on it. So mine was premium muslin, and what I did with my book is once I figured out how many rows I was going to need per page, the other element of that is that our machines have a maximum stitch width of 9 millimeters. So half an inch is slightly more than 9 millimeters. So I used 18 stitches times half an inch which basically leads you up to about 9 inches of actual stitching space that you're going to need. I think that's about right. Could be off a little bit because I'm not doing my math in my head probably very accurate. Plus about a 1-inch title bar space at the top of the page. So my end result from the pages that I'm using in my book now for my 15,000, I'm cutting my pages at 6 inches wide by 12 inches high. So when I'm cutting my fabric off of the width of the fabric, I'm cutting off strips of 6 inches wide fabric. That means that I'm going to get 6 strips of fabric per yard of fabric. Okay, 6 times 6 equals 36. The other thing about your book, that basically means that you're going to have 18 pieces of fabric. Each page in your book, and we're going to call them book pages, is 2 pieces of fabric. So you're going to have a front side of your page and you're going to have a back side of your page. All right, so that means that per yard of fabric, you're going to be able to make 9 pages for your book. Okay, so how many pages are you going to need for your own book? That's going to depend on you. And what I'm going to tell you to do is just look at the machine stitches and figure out, you know, what is it that you want to include in your stitch book. When I look at my stitch book that I made for my 12,000 machine, this is my cover for my book, and then my first page in my book is my buttonhole page. And I think that what I did when I was creating this book, and I'm not 100% sure if that was what my thought process was because this is already many years ago, I think that in the beginning I wasn't certain that I was going to stitch out the utility stitches. So that's why on the back side of my cover is why it's the buttonholes rather than utility stitches. And I think that probably what I then decided was it was important to do utility stitches, so I proceeded on from there. But the planning that you need to do is that this center information, what I call the information bar, which is on the little side bars of your pages, you need to plan out what order of the categories of your stitches are going to be in your book right from the very beginning. Because what you're going to be doing is, if this is the cover and then this is going to be page 1 of actual stitches, you're going to want your information bar to be at the center, always at the center of where your pages are going to be at as you open your book. Okay, and why do you want them there, the information bars there? Because this is where you're going to be putting your grommets. The grommets are about a 3/4 inch size that I purchased at Joann's Fabric Store, and they're over on the notions wall near where you've got elastic and snaps and that kind of thing. Okay, punching holes in this fabric, if you were to be punching the holes out here for your grommets, you know, on top of your decorative stitches, you might damage those stitches. And that's why I wanted my information bars to be at the center of my book. And that's why I wanted my stitches to radiate out from that center point so that I wouldn't risk damaging my stitches with the grommets. So you need to keep that in mind. So what I've done with my books when I've made them is I've decided what order I want my categories to come into, how many pages, book pages, I'm actually going to need for each one of those categories, and therefore I'm able to plan out, you know, what's going to be on the front side and what's going to be on the back side of each one of those pages. All right, so like here I've got a quilting section, and it finishes up right here with quilting, and we keep going on through. That was the last page of quilting stitches. It didn't complete the whole page, but that was fine with me. And then the next category that I was adding on to here was my satin stitches. So, you know, plan ahead, all right, so that all of these information bars come out in the center of your pages. So these empty blocks here, you know, if you wanted to not waste this amount of space, you could go ahead and start your next category and start stitching those down, you know, and again, that would just be you keeping track of how many stitches you need to include per page in your book, and that's going to be a personal preference for you. So your fabric requirements is basically you're going to be getting 9 book pages per yard of fabric. Your decor bond is about the same width as your quilter's cotton or your muslin fabric, and so it's going to be about the equivalent amount of decor bond that you're also going to need. You're going to have little strips left over after you cut these apart and then subcut them into 12-inch pieces and to do your sewing of your lines on. And those little pieces of fabric, you know, that's something that you can just save in your stash also to use kind of like I've done with these things, you know, to use them as little sample stitch outs. So I hope that that is helpful to you. So it's really, really important that you, right from the very beginning, that you plan what pages you want to include in your book, and then what order you want them to be stitched out in. So I don't mean that that means you have to technically stitch them out in that order, but that you're allowing for that amount of stitches per page, and they're going to all come together at the end of it. So what do you want to include? Again, that's going to be up to you. When I plan my stitch book, because of the style of stitching that I tend to do, I'm most interested in not just seeing the appearance of the stitches, but also what the size of the stitches are. And also, as I alter the size of the stitches, what that's going to actually look like. So I've got, I don't know, this is actually the best page to be looking at. Let me see if I have a different one. Let's look at, well, I guess this is all right. So what I typically will do is I will start off by stitching out that pattern as a single motif, and then so I can see what it looks like in its default size. Then I typically, or sometimes, it kind of depends on the stitch pattern, and this is just something that you have to get a feel for as you're looking at the stitch and kind of decide, what do I want to know about this particular stitch. So now I stitched it out in the default size, what they look like connected. Then I really pay attention to how I am able to mirror image that stitch, because all of the decorative stitches, you're going to be able to flip them on the vertical. There are a few in your machine that you are also going to be able to flip on the horizontal, a very few. There's not a whole lot of them. And actually on your sewing machine, when you look at the panel of decorative stitches on the lid of your machine, if any of them have sort of a gray background on them, that means it's a stitch that's going to be able to be horizontally flipped. Okay, so what I've done with this one is, this is one that's been able to be horizontally flipped. So this is its default. Then I flipped it, and I did a couple of more back in that opposite direction. And then with my marker, I've drawn a little line down there to show that that was what happened with that particular stitch, was that I used a horizontal flipping motion on it. This was a stitch that, as I looked at it, I decided that it probably was one that I rarely would probably alter the size of very much, and that's why I didn't do a whole lot of experimenting with stitch widths on it. I do have a very narrow one down here at the end, but then there's some of them, like this is going to be the default. This is the default and it's connected, and then I made it down at probably about a size 7mm in width. And I thought, as I stitched it out, probably I wouldn't ever want to do it much narrower than that, because it might get too tiny. This one here, you can see I've played a lot with, from the default connected, probably a 7 down to a 5, and I've also played with the stitch length of them and squeezed them together. So what do you want from your stitches? It's going to depend on you, and it's going to be reflective of just the information that you want to have recorded about your stitches. Okay, so there's no hard and fast rule about that. One of the things that I did discover about stitching these things out is that, oh, what was I going to say about it? Oh, that different kinds of threads will also make your stitches look different. So in my original book for my 12,000, I chose to use a 30 weight cotton thread, and I stitched all of my pages in black with that thread. And I wanted to use that 30 weight because I felt like it gave a nice, substantial, heavier look to the decorative stitches, and they show up really well with that. But I don't typically do machine decorative stitching with a 30 weight thread. And so for my 15,000 book, I've defaulted back, for the most part, to just an embroidery thread. And actually with this one, I've gotten a little more adventurous for me. So on my decorative stitches, I'm doing the front side I'm doing with blue thread, and then my back side I'm doing with some green thread, just to kind of shake it up a little bit. And I did do some of them, like these heirloom stitches. Just going to show that real quickly. These are all of these ones that are kind of an old-fashioned cross stitch sort of looking stitch, and I did use a 30 weight cotton thread for these ones because I liked doing that. One of the things that I did with these, this is page 3 of heirloom, this is page 4 of heirloom, and you can see that there was only 3 stitches before it left a whole big old blank space. So what I did with this one is I just played around with some stitch combinations in the heirloom category, and just did some fun stuff in that empty space, and made a couple of notes about it. All right, so that's what I did there. One of the other things that I want to make you are also aware of is that your stitch book is also meant to be a reference for you, so that in the future you've done some of the preliminary work, and so making notes on your pages of your stitch book is, to me, is a pretty important thing. It's one of the things that I wanted to have record of. So on my buttonhole page, what I did is I wrote down next to the buttonhole what type of fabric it was recommended for. Towards the bottom of the page, these are also from the buttonhole section of the machine, and they are little bar tacks and decorative bar tacks, and these are some eyelets that are built into the machine. And so what I did with these ones, because they can be a little bit confusing when you're actually at the sewing machine and you're starting to stitch them out, what I did with these is I drew in some little arrows, and I hope that those show up really well to show that this is the direction that the machine was actually stitching these little bar tacks out in. So this would have been the back, and it would have been stitching, stitching, stitching coming forward. That's what those little arrows are for. So that's my reference point, which is, to me, is important, because it's not always obvious what direction some of these things are going to be stitching out in when it's in that buttonhole mode. So that was important to me. On my utility page, what I am doing here, I've gotten some of this information out of the manual. Some of this information is also apparent on your screen whenever you are pulling up these stitches in the utility mode. It might tell you, for example, that it's an overcasting stitch. It may tell you that, for example, this right here is a blind hem, and this is a blind hem for a woven fabric. This is a blind hem for a stretch fabric. And then, just some other ones. So I've used a Micron pen, which you can get at the quilting store. You can order them. It's a permanent ink. It's a super fine point, and it works beautifully on your fabric. It will not wash out if this were ever to get wet. Another option for writing your notes and your stitch numbers and all of that would be to use a regular ballpoint pen if you've got a nice ink that will show up well on your fabric. You could use a Sharpie, very fine point Sharpie pen, but I have had experience with some Sharpie pens where if the ink has gotten wet, that it has actually run on my fabric, and so I don't think that's your very best choice, but if that's all you have, that is also acceptable. So that's some of the information that I like to record in my stitch book. And then the last thing that I want to just zoom in on actually is the edge finishing technique that I did on my pages. So I'm just going to put this pretty close to the camera and hopefully talk you through this. So once you've got your pages stitched out, what you're going to do then is you're going to match up the front side of the page with the back side of the page, and you will 505 spray them together to hold them together temporarily. And then you're going to trim them down. Well, you'll be trimming them down then so that they're nice and square. And then you'll be ready to actually do an edge finishing technique. Now, this is one that I came up with on my own, and again, it was through trial and error and just experimenting with stitches on the machine. I explained this fairly well in the handout that I gave you, but I'll walk you through it so it makes sense to you. It's a 4-step process. So the first step is that I use the same color of thread in my top and in my bobbin of the fabric, and I just did a straight stitch, fairly short stitch length, just to hold those two sides of the pages together. Then with the same thread, matching thread in the top and bobbin, I moved over to my M foot, which is an overcasting foot, and one of the stitches, and it's pictured in your handout, and I did an overcasting edge all the way around in that same color of thread. So then for step number 3, I did that same stitch, but that time I used the red thread. All right, and then for step number 4, I changed my thread to black for the top and the bobbin, and I used an applique stitch, and I just kind of and I adjusted the stitch width on it too so that it just overlaps, so that the zigzag here, is inside, and then the straight stitch part of it overlaps on the outside edge of it. That gave it a little bit more security for those overcasted edges, and it also just added a little bit more interest. So what I've got then is a real durable edge finish for my book. It takes a little bit of time to accomplish that, but I'm really happy with it. I think that it works really well. It feels good in my hands when I'm actually working with my book, and I would recommend that you would take the time to go ahead and do that. One of the other stitch books that I made in the past, I just used my pinking shears, and I just pinked my edges, and that works okay too. It's not as pretty and not quite as functional. So those are just some of the things that I wanted to share with all of you about, some of the thoughts and procedures that I have used as I've created my own stitch book. And I think that probably other than that, the handout's going to be pretty helpful to you. If you have any questions, I'd be welcome to try to address them. But the other thing that I would really like from you is, I need to talk about the applique stitches. And what made me think about the applique stitches is because one of my students in the past did her applique page a little bit different than I did mine. So this is my applique page. And what I did with it is I figured, an applique stitch is just going to look like, some sort of a little blanket stitch unless I've got something to make it look a little bit different. So I used the triple straight stitch in the utility mode, and with red thread, I stitched straight lines on each one of my bars. Then I changed to my black decorative stitching thread, and I sampled out all the different applique stitches in reference, pretending that red line was the edge of a piece of fabric, just so that I could see how it would fall against that edge of the fabric. So I hope that makes sense to you. In my information bar, I have also designated if it was a middle position stitch, or if it was a right position stitch, or left, or whatever it might be. Okay, so again, that's information. And the other thing that happens with it is it actually looks a little different in the space bar, depending on whether or not it's a left position stitch or right or whatever that might be. So that's relevant information. And the reason that I almost had forgotten to mention that is because one of my students had a good idea, and it turned out very beautifully as well. She actually fused on little strips of fabric in each one of these spaces. And then she did her applique stitches on that edge of that fabric, and that really gave a great representation of what the stitch looked like on an actual applique. So that was a good idea. And the jumping off point was that when you come up with good ideas, the rest of us would love to hear your good ideas that you've also come up with for your own stitch book, because that may inspire us to maybe even do some of our pages differently. And then there is one other category on our 15,000 that that I did not have on my 12,000, and that is the tapered stitches. Gosh, I just had it here a little while ago. Okay, so the tapering, it's not going to be listed on the lid of the sewing machine, but it is one of the categories when you open up the menu bar and you start looking at the different categories of decorative stitches. Tapered stitches are not just a decorative stitch, but they're also a function. So what they are is, if you don't already know this, is that they create miters at corners so that we can do really neat border techniques and shapes and different things like that. There's a lot of stitches that are built into the tapering stitch function, and I did not want to actually take the time to stitch out every single one of those decorative stitches. My sample page includes the decorative stitch, but with a sampling of what it might look like at the different angles that we can use in the tapering mode. So for example, on this satin stitch here, I did every single sample of the tapers, a 30, 45, 60, and on and on, because that's what I felt was relevant for my tapered stitches. Someday I may go back in and redo my tapered stitch page and do all of the stitches with all of the angles, but for right now, this is adequate for me for my book. You may choose to do yours differently. And so anyway, I think that's basically about everything that I wanted to talk about with this little video for you. And again, just let us all know if you've got questions or good ideas or whatever for your own stitch book. Now, I do want to tell you, it is a very time-intensive project. This is going to take you a substantial amount of time to actually make, because your first thing is going to be preparing your fabrics. Step number 2 is going to be doing your straight stitches to create your rows and your title bars. That's super important. Don't skip it, because that helps to hold your fabric onto your stabilizer, and it will actually help any of that pushing and pulling that happens when you're doing your decorative stitches. If you've got that fabric stabilized with all of those straight rows, kind of think of it as notebook paper, and this is your rule across the side, horizontal rule, and then here's your margins that you have built in there. So anyway, that's kind of what I thought about when I was making my stitch book. My new book for my 15,000 is going to be very similar to this one. I think it's just a tiny bit wider. This one here is not even really quite 6 inches wide. I think this one, if I pull out my ruler, I'll look at it real quickly. Finished dimension on this book here is about 4.5 inches wide. Okay, so now that I did my 15,000 book, these pages are actually going to end up being probably a finished width of a little bit less than 6 inches. All right, because I really did feel like I needed that extra width on the page that I did not incorporate into my 12,000 books. So anyway, I hope all of that information helps, and get sewing, because it's going to take you some while and you're going to learn a lot about your sewing machine, and you're going to end up with a really beautiful reference book that you will find useful as you sit at your sewing machine and sew. Okay, friends, that's it for now. Thanks for watching the video, and have fun stitching your stitch book.